what is the World Bank? Because for a lot of Malaysians, the World Bank brings with it a lot of connotations. You know, it's a Bretton Woods institutions, Washington consensus. It's this thing which likes to control people with the IMF, and you know, politicians who are under the thumb of the World Bank and the IMF tend to like to raise interest rates and things like that. I mean, this is the popular perception. So, Apurva, are you this sort of secret society bringing about new global order, wanting to control developing countries and less developed countries?
So thanks for the question, Kyrie and Cheryl. Nice to be on the podcast. Before I begin, let me say that the last two podcasts you've had TMJ, you've had Tun Mahathir, and obviously the ratings were not high enough for you guys that you got a World Bank economist to be here, right? So, anyway, jokes apart, thanks for the invite. So listen, the World Bank, I mean, all that you said is partly true, partly perception, partly not, right? So we are a Bretton Woods institution. We were associated with the structural adjustment loans in the past, but we are an institution that constantly keeps reinventing ourselves. So the phrase I like using is that development is a game of snakes and ladders. And we do not have the ultimate say in how development in the country occurs. The most we can do is to advise governments, but ultimately it's up to them what they want to do with that advice. And in the case of Malaysia, we do not lend any money to Malaysia. So you had mentioned my previous roles in Kenya, for example, where I was overseeing 4 countries, where we had lending. So Africa, for example, needs our money. Malaysia does not because it's at a upper income, middle income sort of status. So what we do in Malaysia is we provide policy advice, technical assistance to the best of our abilities, tailored and customized to Malaysia as much as we possibly can. So I guess to conclude, I would say we like taking facts, evidence, analysis, and spreading them as widely as possible.
I personally have enjoyed watching you. I know we're friends and we have a
We have Bob
relationship
Dylan
of
in
friendship,
common.
and we have Dylan in common and cricket fandom.
And cricket.
But all that aside, you mentioned how World Bank is reinventing itself. I've noticed, I don't know, KJ, if you've noticed, Apurva is one of the most active economic commentators on X, previously known as Twitter. I wonder if that's something that you've done deliberately in your personal capacity, or is that something that the World Bank is doing throughout its engagements?
So I guess it's a bit of both. So if you look at my Twitter account, I make the claim that these are my personal views, but I'm an economist with the World Bank, right? So that affiliation is definitely there. And I do sometimes, I guess you could say, go out on a limb and say things, but there's a reason for that, Cheryl. I think one of the things I'd like to make a distinction is this confusion between clients and counterparts. Okay, mm-hmm. This is something that I give advice to young ones interested in the development business, those joining the World Bank. Sometimes, admittedly, even my own colleagues in the World Bank confuse it too. It's a long answer, but I'll get to the point. So counterparts are the government counterparts we work with, whereas our clients are the citizens of the country we are active in. In this case, in the case of Malaysia, our clients are the rakyat, right? And the counterparts are ways we engage with government bodies to improve the well-being of the rakyat. So there's a difference between counterparts and clients. And what I find interesting about social media in particular these days, and X formerly known as Twitter, is that there's a direct interface with the rakyat, with our clients. So that's why I'm out there, because I think it's really important for us to share our views, to share my views, and to have a direct interface with ultimately why we're here, which is to improve the well-being of the client.
But just back to the World Bank, people would like to also find out a little bit more about the governance of the bank. So who owns this bank? Do countries pay this bank a subscription every year to be part of the community of nations? Who runs the bank? I was told that the president of the World Bank customarily comes from the United States, and the MD of the IMF comes from Europe, and so this sounds like it's a bank that is led by a leadership from the United States, has a disproportionate voice and influence on the agenda of the World Bank. Maybe you can explain that a bit.
Sure. So let me explain to you from on two fronts. On the personal front, my personal experience, I've been with the World Bank over 20 years, since 2000, and I've sort of seen it all in many ways, worked in many different parts of the World Bank, and under the governance structure. So the way, in simple words, is that we are owned by the countries that pay in sort of shares to the World Bank, right? So we are owned by the countries we work for. And the US happens to be the largest shareholder. So that is a fact, right? Now, this perception that we are run by the US, by the Americans, and this and that, this is where, let me just share with you my personal experience. I'm a humble lead economist, so I'm not at that level in the World Bank hierarchy. But the 22, 23 years I've been in the bank, not once have I felt any pressure, any political pressure to take one view or the other. So as I said, at least in my role, what I've always been encouraged to do, and which I, with no holds barred, is to take evidence, facts, analysis, and make them viral, spread them. So that's my answer to you, Kerry.
Kevin?
Can I ask something that's maybe a bit more technical but good for some of our audience to know? There's a program called Young Professionals Leaders Program for the World Bank under the age of 35. You want to say a little bit more about that and maybe how Malaysians can aspire to apply for this program?
Yeah, so there are many ways of joining the World Bank, and the best way, or the most popular way in some ways, is this YP, the Young Professional Program. And we take applicants and applications from around the world, and these are typically masters, PhD graduates with some work experience from all walks of life. They don't have to be economists. You can be an anthropologist, you can be a sociologist, and the whole idea is to it's extremely competitive, right? But it offers you a sort of a structured way of joining the World Bank and then moving up the ladder, so to speak. So when I joined the World Bank, I was an OP. I was an old professional. I had missed the deadline because I was in the private sector before joining the bank. So I joined it at the mid sort of career.
Kari, one of our friends is actually YP at the World Bank, Marcus Lee from Oxford. I'm not sure whether you remember him.
Marcus. Yes.
So there are Malaysians there. Just wanted to highlight that.
Yes, very much so, yeah. And Kari, just going back to your question on, you said that the president of the World Bank is customarily appointed by the US, etc. Again, that is true, and same with the IMF, but I think that is changing as well. So what you have seen, at least what I've seen in the last few transitions, that post is becoming increasingly contested. So now anybody from around the world can announce a candidacy, there are interviews, so on and so forth. So I think you see much more contestability, and maybe I'm a bit biased, but I'm proud to say that our current president, even though he holds an American passport, he's of Ajay Banga.
Yes,
he's of Indian origin. He proudly calls himself as made in India, which really resonates with me. So
just a last point on this governance issue and the leadership of the World Bank, since I'm interested in these kind of things. And I understand you're a lead economist, and I don't want you to cross the line, so to speak. But yes, the post of the president of the World Bank is increasingly more competitive. People can apply for it. But it's still subject to the realpolitik of global politics. I think that's something we have to accept. Do you think in our lifetime we can see a president from the global south, proper global south, as in a citizen of the global south?
I'm optimistic. Again, I'm not saying it just because I'm a man of the institution, but I've seen how contestable the post is getting with each transition. And I think it's not if, but when. That is my hope. I'm optimistic about it.
We want to quickly get into the Malaysia story and your observations. But maybe one bit before that, you mentioned about how your role is to bring evidence and data to your council, to your counterparts, in the case the government of Malaysia. How receptive has the Malaysian government been? Point one. Question number two is, one of the criticisms about the World Bank, or institutions like the World Bank, is that, yes, you're driven by evidence and data of a certain sort, but do you fully appreciate the local politics and local reality? So two-part question.
So both great questions, Charles. So on the first one, so let me just benchmark my experience in my previous post, which was Russia. So I was in Russia for 5 years. where I have to say, partly due to culture, partly due to language, access to policymakers wasn't that straightforward. Right? And we still had access to the Central Bank of Russia, MOF, etc. But what I find so nice about being in Malaysia is that access is quite ready. I mean, you can access the policymakers. The fact that I'm sitting with you, Khari, you as former health minister, Sharil.
We're nobodies. I hope you have access to the ministers.
No, but that's we do have access to ministers, and I think that's just something that goes underappreciated in many ways. So access is really not an issue, but of course, access is just the starting point. You also have to demonstrate value. In terms of what you do, what you say, how you present things, which leads me to your second question. The political economy of any country is different in many ways, and in some ways, and I'll say this sort of a mea culpa. The World Bank has its reputation of, we come in with sort of first best solutions, and that's the perception at least. And again, in my years of working in different country contexts in 4 different continents, it's you really have to appreciate the political economy. The world at best is second best. Okay, so instead of always pushing for the theoretically first best option, you do have to take into account the political. And I'll explain, if we have time, I'll give you a concrete example. Take subsidy reform in Malaysia, right? So one approach is, well, subsidies are a drain for the fiscal purse, and so therefore we need to rationalize them. That is true, but it's much more complicated than that. The fact that in the case of Malaysia, subsidies are 3% of GDP, almost, more than double of what Singapore or Thailand spends. So they've been there for a while, and subsidies have become sort of pervasive in Malaysia. You could almost argue that it's seeped into the psyche of the Malaysians, and which I understand. So instead of saying, well, that doesn't matter, and we have to sort of address the subsidy issue. If you're a person, I mean, half of Malaysians earn less than 2,400, 2,500 ringgit, barely above the minimum wage of 1,500. So if you're a person in that half, you ask yourself, has the government done everything else before they start taking my subsidies away? Now, that's a political economy issue. And politicians then respond to they want to get re-elected. So you see how it becomes so difficult. So I think a better appreciation of those sorts of issues, which is why it's so valuable to be in the field and to talk to people from all across the spectrum. So that's the way we inform our policy advice. And one final thing on subsidy, I know you have a question, Kerry. One final thing on subsidy reform is that, again, so if you look at it, what is the subsidy for? And there are typically 2 reasons. One is for equity reasons, one is for efficiency reasons. And I think we've gone, and that is not explained properly, if I can say so, by many policymakers, and they sometimes confuse the 2, right? So if you look at equity, if you look at fuel subsidies, we all know that the bulk of the benefits goes to the top T20 as known in Malaysia, right? And so the World Bank then does these fancy simulations and say, well, if you took the subsidy away, and it would reduce poverty by X%, all right? But this is the political economy that I think we also need to continually work on. If you rationalize subsidies, it's good for the poor, okay? No doubt. And the rich can get by. But it's the middle class that gets hurt arguably the most from these subsidies. So addressing understanding the political economy of the middle class, what is it that they want? Because they would have the subsidy mostly removed from them. And do they want part of these subsidies to be to go for the global good? For example, for EVs and for public charging infrastructure to address global warming. Is it mostly for the regional good? To help for the national good? Should Malaysia use some of these subsidy savings and pay down national debt? Is it for the local good towards public transportation? Or is it for poverty reduction? Would the middle class be okay in taking all these subsidy savings and channeling to the poor? So we don't have answers. I don't think anybody in Malaysia, it's not just us, anybody in Malaysia has answers to these questions as of now. So again, better understanding the political economy, in particular the middle class in Malaysia, is really important.
Just before we get into the discussion on Malaysia, I just wanted to talk about our interaction with the World Bank, maybe Kian, your experience as Deputy Minister. I can confirm what you said, in a sense that the World Bank, at least in Malaysia, is very advisory, since we don't take loans from you. And I've never been imposed anything from the World Bank when I was in cabinet or when I was in government. But the question I wanted to ask you was, what happens with countries who take loans from you? And for the benefit of listeners, typically countries from the global south, less developed countries, they will take loans from the World Bank for development projects. Malaysia did many years ago. The International Bank for Reconstruction, I think, initially gave Malaysia some loans for infrastructure way back when, just after independence. But in those cases, I'm just interested, in those cases, do you have conditions attached to those loans?
So we have a whole, sort of process in place, the way loans are done. And if I hark back to my experience in working in Kenya and all, right, so there is a process. We jointly identify what the gap is, where the gap is, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in schools, hospitals, social infrastructure, and then we give loans. And most of these are subsidized loans, at least in the context of Africa, etc. And that's the way it works. Sometimes there are conditions, sometimes there are not. So, some of the conditions are, for example, okay, if you take money from the World Bank, then you better have a proper procurement system in place. Because as we know, most of the leakages happen in infrastructure during procurement, right? So you adopt some of the best practices that we have formed over the last 60, 70 years. And so if you call that a condition, okay, call it a condition, but I think it's a healthy, good condition to have. Or you won't destroy the environment when you take a loan from the World Bank and build something, right? So those are good conditions, one can argue. I was about to say something else, but I lost my train of thought.
I'll just add on a bit to that. I think one of the value propositions that the World Bank brings to countries like Malaysia and other developing countries would be the comparisons that they can make with other countries. We may not be aware of what's happening in Kenya, in Russia, or other places where you have inputs and experience in. But if, let's say, we want to know about what you're doing with regards to SME digitalization, you have contacts in other places that we don't have access to. My personal experience as Deputy Minister of MITI was an exercise that the World Bank took in terms of making certain propositions and proposals on the investment promotion agencies, MIDA and some of the regional corridors. And we can see now the Prime Minister is putting that into place by having some sort of process of some level of consolidation among the IPAs.
Great. Yeah, Sharon, you want to jump in?